That's how you say it. But it was open. Yeah, for me. Okay, I think yeah. They're kind of cool. Alrighty, everyone, good afternoon and welcome back to our afternoon session all about climate finance. I'm really excited to dive deep into this conversation because it is something that I have been intimately learning about, just as being at the core of how we get to co-create a sustainable future forward for all of us throughout the Caribbean. It's grounded in our ability to learn how we can receive our financing, to manage that financing and ensure that those funds are redistributed to the people and the communities on the ground who need to do the work that they know that needs to be done. And so often, right now, the climate conversation is taking place at a very high level, where so many of the average day people, the people who are running the civic organizations, the people who are knowing what needs to happen in their respective communities, aren't exactly aware of how they can access the financing that they need. And 9 out of 10 times they're operating within systems that don't create or the infrastructure doesn't exist for them to even receive the resources that are available, or because of unethical, historical, colonial realities, countries are deemed high income because resources are being stored, whether it's for offshore banking or foreign investment purposes that increase the GDP, because GDP is the current form of or metric that's being used, despite the fact for the past 30 years they've been exploring MVIs and how a variability index would actually improve our ability to specifically address, but you need to have an MVI for each specific financial or category, right? So today we're going to dive into a lot of these conversations around finance and what that means for those of us on the ground, how we can understand this language better, and what we need to do to put a plan together so that we have the financial infrastructure to receive, access, and manage these finances, and also the plans in place to execute the programmings that we need in our respective communities. So right now we're going to give the floor to our first speaker, Ryan. I think he's with us already online from USAID. We're really excited to learn from you. Ryan, please take it away.
Thank you so very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. So it's my absolute pleasure to be here at this regional conference on youth for climate change. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to speak with you all because as young people getting involved in this field, advocacy is so very important. And it's my absolute pleasure to talk to you about an area that I'm very familiar with, which is climate finance. And it's one of those topical conversations, especially as we approach the Conference of Parties, that I think you should be aware of. So in the next 8.5 minutes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quick sort of overview of climate finance, its definition, some key terms, and I'll be here with you for the rest of the hour to discuss and panel any questions you may have. So to get started, if we could change our slides, please. I just want to start off with understanding what is climate finance. Marjan, if you could change that for me. Great. And climate finance. Now, there is a technical definition, and what you have on screen before you is the definition from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC's Standing Committee of Finance. And what they've done is they've defined climate finance as financing that is aimed at reducing emissions, enhancing sinks of greenhouse gases, reducing the vulnerability and increasing the resilience of human and ecological systems to address climate impacts. It's a lot of big words, but effectively, what it means is that climate finance is money that we use for climate mitigation and climate adaptation outcomes. What's important about this definition is that, all they are, the definition is centered around the outcome, right? We define climate finance as money that goes towards climate mitigation and climate adaptation. Our next slide, please. So if we know that that is what it is, the question is, well, how much climate finance is there? How much money is there right now? And how much is needed to deal with the adverse impacts that we're currently experiencing and we will experience as the planet continues to warm? And to do that, I have an analogy because I feel like when we talk about money and we talk about climate finance, we use a lot of terms that are abstract to most of us. We talk about things in terms of millions and billions and trillions. And these are all things that, to be honest, in my lifetime, I don't know if I've seen a trillion of anything. I can't visualize what a trillion means. So I have this analogy to help you understand. So I'm sure we've all seen a bottle of water, right? And I don't know in the conference hall if you have any available there in front of you. But if you imagine that one bottle of water, the volume of water inside of there was equal to $236 million US dollars, that would be the total amount of climate finance distributed globally throughout the entire world in 2020. That bottle of water is how much money we've put into climate finance in 2020. And if we decided that we wanted to look at how we not only give out money and grants for climate change, but for all types of development work, for education, for reducing poverty, the total amount of money annually is about 200 billion. And using that in terms of bottled waters, that would be the same as having 44 cases of bottled water. 44 cases is how much we give to all our sustainable development issues. But when we look at how climate change is affecting small island developing states in particular, like Barbados, like Trinidad and Tobago, like all of our islands here in the Eastern and Southern Caribbean, right? We know that in order to deal with the consequences and in order to green our industries, to reduce our emissions, we need a total of $2 trillion every year. And what does that look like in water? $2 trillion is enough water to fill the entire conference hall that you are sitting in right now. And I want you to just imagine that for a moment in scale. The amount of money we use each year in the whole planet, in the whole world, is one bottle of water. And the amount of money that we need just for our small island developing states is enough to fill that room. So what you can see here is that there's a huge gap. There's a monumental gap in terms of how much money there is and how much is available. And in order for SIDS to to achieve our climate outcomes, we need a magnitude increase of about 1,300 times what is currently being done annually. It's a lot of money that we need. Next slide, please. So I want to do a breakdown to show you all what we call our global finance flows. And we know what the gap is, we know what is required, but what does the landscape currently look like? And this very funny graph kind of shows us a few different things. But what it mainly shows out that I want to pull out is that all of the climate finance currently, and when our latest global data comes from 2020, in 2020, there was about $653 billion issued in climate finance globally, not just for SIDS, but globally, right? And in that, you could see that it came from both public sources, meaning from government donors, governments, as well as private sector, as in companies, right? 90% of all of that money went into mitigation actions. Things like solar power plants and wind energy. And only 10% went into what we call adaptation activities, the things that are most critical for us in small island developing states. What this graph also shows us is that the way that the money moves from the developed world to the developing world is through various mechanisms and intermediaries using instruments. These are all specific climate terms, but basically there's a lot of different pathways that it takes going from the developed world to the developing world. And as my final slide, the next slide, please. And on my final slide, what I want to show you is just to tell you, as we discuss climate finance mechanisms, what that really means. And a mechanism is a structure that supports the deployment of financial resources. It's different from an instrument, right? If it is, for example, a bank, you could think of a bank as being a mechanism and a loan as being an instrument, right? So the mechanism is the structure itself that allows for the deployment of financial resources. And when we think about mechanisms, there's some little tips or secrets that we use to identify them, right? You could usually identify them because they're a fund, a facility, or some sort of organization. And we use a classification system to sort different mechanisms. I've sorted them into 3 buckets here for you. There's multilateral meaning multiple countries put money towards something, right? Think about a piggy bank where all of us put something inside of it. That's a multilateral source. A bilateral source would be a source between 2 people from one country to another, 1-to-1. And in private sector, you could imagine would have to do with markets and businesses and companies. And what I have here on the slide are just a few examples of some of the different mechanisms that currently exist. In terms of multilateral mechanisms, some of the most prominent and well-known ones to us would be the Global Environment Facility, or the GEF, the Green Climate Fund, and one here called the Capacity Building Initiative for Transparency, CBIT. All 3 of these are operational in the Caribbean SIDS and are relevant to us. In terms of bilateral mechanisms, there are a few that you may be familiar with. There's the Global Climate Change Alliance, or the GCCA, which is the EU's, the European Union's a bilateral relationship with our countries. There's the Caribbean Climate Investment Program, which is a special program set up by the United States to support Caribbean countries. And there's the Nordic Development Fund, for example, from Norway, that also supports some of our countries. In terms of private sector, I've identified a couple of investment firms and big organizations that invest specifically into clean energy and climate adaptation. And you could see there's a few here: MCP Caribbean, Deakin Impact, and Republic Bank. I'm sure most of you know what Republic Bank is, but Republic Bank in 2021 would have established a 200 million climate fund to give out loans for climate projects, right? And this is an example of private sector being a mechanism to support our needs. So on my final slide, I just want to say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share this bit of information with you. to kind of help you understand where we are in climate finance, what it means, and what are some mechanisms. And I definitely welcome the conversation to come over the rest of the hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ryan. That was, I think, a wonderful grounding for us and for myself included in just where we are within the financial landscape. And a question that I have for you, maybe just to get this conversation started, is I notice some funding is available to some countries, right? So it's very specific or particular as to who has access to what. And the realities on the ground versus what we need as Caribbean people in order to adapt. Because as young people, our realities are real, and they need to be addressed, and it requires financial support. And we're also acutely aware that accessing that financial support requires us to go through various channels. But a lot of these current systems don't take us into account. Many of us young people don't actually even have bank accounts, and so my question is, what in earnest needs to be done to ensure that these financial pathways are created for both young people and peoples of local communities around the world, but obviously in this case, specifically the Caribbean, to be able to meaningfully access the financial resources to adapt, knowing that what we need is adaptation financing and understanding, as you so clearly articulated, that that's like the hardest financing to come by. How do we proceed?
Oh, that's a great question. So, yes, adaptation financing is some of the hardest to come by. And at the global level, at COP28, we will continue to explore as a global community, how do we increase the amount of contributions towards adaptation money, meaning from different countries, from different countries in the developed world, putting money towards adaptation for us in the developing world. The existing mechanisms in play, so let's look at some of them, for example, like the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund is unique in that there is a 50-50 split. There's about $10 billion inside of there, half of which is allocated strictly for adaptation projects, some for mitigation. Under the UNFCCC, there's an adaptation fund, which is strictly for adaptation projects. Now, as you rightly said, some countries may be more eligible than others. When it comes to the Green Climate Fund, all of our Caribbean states are eligible. However, the paperwork and the process of accessing that money could be quite onerous. So to answer your question as to how do we as youth and how do we as people of the Caribbean access these funds or better position ourselves to access these funds, I would say that there are a couple of things that we could do. The first thing is that we need to have more conversations like this one, and we need to find ourselves educated and empowered to be able to utilize these pathways. A lot of times, yeah, I'm not saying that the pathway is easy. It is quite cumbersome, but I wasn't born a climate finance specialist. I wasn't born knowing everything about the GCF, right? It took time for me to actually read the documents, learn the documents, and engage with other professionals who are in that space for me to get a handle on it. And what I did, I would say, in a past life prior to USAID, a lot of my work would have been around going to civil society organizations, going to other organizations and helping them develop their concept notes, their proposals, and understand what needs to be done. So I think the first thing that we need to do is we need to understand the game that we're playing, right? We need to understand the rules, the systems, the players, the pieces, and think about any kind of game that you play. So first one, educating ourselves. The second thing that I think we need to do is once we understand the process for any particular fund, I think we need to also become advocates, right? As young people, our power is in our voice. And I really truly believe that our powers and our voice, our ability to speak up, to stand for something, and to hold others to account. The process is slow and bureaucratic, but it's also it's allowed to be because people aren't putting pressure on them. And as young people, if we understand the process, we are able to advocate and we are able to say, hey, we really want to improve our financing. Every country in the world under the Green Climate Fund is eligible to receive um up to $1 million per year to support national adaptation planning, right?
I'll hear that.
Why isn't our government doing that, right? Who is our national designated authority? Why aren't we using our voice to put pressure on them and ask them these questions? So these are the kinds of things that we could do. One, informing ourselves better about the process so that we could help others and help ourselves. And then two, becoming advocates so that we could speak truth to power and help move things along faster.
Thank you so much. I think, the importance of us educating ourselves is critical. And it reminds me of the conversation that started this morning in the art session where we talked about the children and we talked about the financial decisions that are being made today. And, at COP28, these meetings are our burden to bear, whether we like it or not. It's the reality. And so it's critical, someone in this room said it earlier, we have no choice but to understand what's going on. Pardon? Okay, we have no choice but to understand what's going on. And so with that, does anyone else have a question that we'd like to offer to Ryan? The mic.
It's not a question, but he did make mention of putting pressure on our local government and whatnot when it comes to the funding. However, this is also a cry of our leaders. Yes, the money is there and it's accessible, but there's so many fine prints to go through to get that money because these international organizations, they put so many restrictions that can only be read between the lines. Even though they're saying the money is free and it's accessible for every country, how easily accessible is it? Is it really as accessible as they say it is? So it's not just applying pressure to our local government, but the international bodies that has the money to make it, to release it so that SIDS could be able to access the money they claim to say, quote unquote, is available to us.
I love that you said that because the money that we've raised for RCOY still hasn't reached my bank account, right? So when Mia Motley's advisor speaks, because I listen into a lot of these talks that he gives, and so he talks about how we're self-funding our adaptation, and that's literally what we're doing, right? So there's that financial burden of us trying to figure out how do we even survive, let alone ensure that we're plugged into the systems that enable us to thrive. And so understanding those mechanisms or creating those mechanisms is what I hope that will come out of today's session. But what we need to do, I would like to, I think it's a good time to now pivot to our next speaker and presenter. And so we would love to invite you to the floor to share with us your presentation. Do we have your presentation?
Pleasant good afternoon to everyone here in present land and those viewing via Zoom land. And it's really pressing when we saw the theme for this year's RCOY, which is Building Financial Resilience for Youth-Led Climate Adaptation in the Caribbean. And it's quite fitting because there's the financial resilience, that component that is very critical in building that area of climate adaptation. So the area that I'm going to focus on is building a paradigm shift towards the 2030 agenda and beyond. So I want to look at a crossroad. All right, so a little patience with us. So thank you again for your patience. And right, so I'll go back the first slide. So I was stated that the theme for this year is RCOY is very fitting because there's a lot of keywords that are there mentioned: financial resilience, climate adaptation, and most important, which is youth-led. So I'm going to take you through a journey, and it starts with the crossroad, just to give you a little framework or a little background of what climate change and how we have to speak about climate change and climate financing. So as we approach this critical juncture towards the advancement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, there's a greater call for action to address the issue of climate change and to retool and reprioritize our national goals and ambitions to ensure that our communities remain resilient for future generations to come. Hence, the theme for this year is quite fitting. And I'm sure there's many persons in this room have been at a point in their life where they're at a crossroad. And we ourselves as communities, as SIDS, we definitely are at a crossroad. As we know, we are in preparation for the COP28 and what is the global stocktake. And that is really to take into consideration what is the trajectory for the advancement of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have 7 years to really pave a pathway towards the 2030 Agenda. So we have to look at the addressing of the global climate change phenomena. How are we going to achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals? And how can we truly build resilience for future generations to come? So the question I'm going to ask you, and I want you to ponder on that, is where do we go from here? So everyone is familiar with the movie Jumanji. There has been so much components of Jumanji, and I saw it very fitting because we are young people and we love to play games and we love to play Monopoly. But I want to take you to this whole concept of a climatic Jumanji. And in the last decade alone, the Caribbean region has been more severely impacted by climate change. We have seen the effects of sea level rises, extreme droughts, floods, Hurricane Maria, Irma, Dorian. But according to the Economic Vulnerability Index, small island developing states are one of the most vulnerable groups of developing countries. As a region, climate change has posed an existential threat to not only our fragile environments, but livelihoods and overall economic growth. These threats have further been exacerbated by the recent COVID-19 pandemic and the war between Russia and Ukraine. So as Ryan was alluding, we have to take into consideration that we have been facing a lot of different threats, and we have to take into account how are we going to really address these issues: sea level rising, floods, COVID-19, droughts, hurricanes. And one of critical importance is balancing of the financing priorities, mitigation and adaptation. For the region to further build its resilience and to chart a way forward towards sustainability, there is a need for an increase in access to financial mechanisms to develop and implement tangible solutions in the area of climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. Most of the countries, developed countries, have provided financial resources for mitigation. They are the ones who are the greater emitters of CO2, but at the same time, they are not providing sufficient resources for us in the region to really focus on adaptation. And that is where we need to take a change, and we need to take a stance of creating a balance for mitigation and adaptation. And when I speak about adaptation, I'm thinking about action to manage the risk of climate change impacts, while mitigation, on the other hand, is the action to reduce emissions that cause climate change. So we have to look at adaptation, disaster risk management, infrastructural support, flood protection, natural environmental resource management. And then on the mitigation side, we look at the transport sector, energy systems, renewable energy. So we as SIDS, we have to look at how we create that paradigm shift of creating a balance between mitigation and adaptation. So then we look at the evolution of the financing instruments, and Ryan would have alluded to some of those instruments, right? To address the issue of lack of financing, established under the Cancun Agreement in 2010, we had what is called the Green Climate Fund. They're based in South Korea, and that came into existence as a financing mechanism under the United Nations Framework on Convention on Climate Change, which is known as the UNFCCC, for the mobilization of 100 billion per year. But one of the things we have realized is that 100 million per year, 100 billion per year, have many of our countries who are here present, Dominica, we have St. Kitts, we have Antigua, we have so much other persons listening online. Have we really seen the evidence of that monies for us in adaptation? I could have a thumbs up or thumbs down for those one are listening. And really and truly, the reality is that there's not sufficient funding agreements or not sufficient funds that were given to countries to help them to do projects for adaptation and mitigation. Then we look at adaptation fund, we have the Green Climate Fund, we have the NDC partnership, we have the climate investment funds. We have so much of funds coming into play, but there's not sufficient funding for projects that we could do adaptation and mitigation. The fund to date has played a fundamental role in charting the way forward in flow of financing to implement a wide range of national projects. Some of the projects include capacity building, the simplified approval process, and even readiness programming. And I think in Dominica, St. Kitts, other countries, Trinidad and Tobago, they have been beneficiaries of readiness programming, but there's still room for improvement. Then there's also capacity building initiatives like workshops, structured dialogues. Even for example, in Grenada, there was the Climate Resilient Water Sector Project. So running a bit forward, I want us to look at the unlocking of tools. And for us to really unlock and to really create that paradigm shift, we have to look at project development and implementation. There must be regional partnerships for the goals. And we know that that is one of the sustainable development goals. There must be a synergy between climate financing, climate action, and also regional partnerships. And as we know CARICOM as a whole, even though we may speak as we are CARICOM, each person have different modes of modalities of approaches to how they look at projects and how they look at adaptation and mitigation. So there must be a regional partnership for the goals. We must also address the bottlenecks to access private sector financing. And as an expert in the field, that has been one of the critical constraints for accessing financing, where the private sector at times is not engaged. Not only the young people, but at times the private sector is not incorporated into stakeholder consultations, and that is an area we must take into consideration. Also, there must be greater and increased commitments and unified actions. If we look at this slide, we see the 5 Cs, which is the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. They have been playing a critical role in the region in terms of advocating, empowering, helping to build capacity for young people, even for governments to access. And that was a signing of a memorandum of agreement with the United Kingdom just earlier this year. Then we have here the president of the Caribbean Development Bank, Dr. Hyginus Leon. He also has been advocating and doing a lot of work with United Nations Climate Change Program. And we know also of Dr. Simon Steele, who has been advocating and doing a lot of work in that area. Then we have CDMO, which is based in Barbados with the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agencies. They have been doing a lot of critical work in the Caribbean region to assist persons, especially, for example, we had Dominica with the last hurricane, we had Bahamas. So they have been providing that technical support to improve early warning system. And that is very critical for us to really advance. So as I proceed, we know that we are now at a place of chartering a new flight. And as young people, RCOY, this is RCOY 2023, we need to raise our standards. We need to navigate into new waters. So we're thinking about the Bridgetown Initiative and the Bridgetown 2.2. One might ask, what does that entail? The Bridgetown Initiative and the Bridgetown 2.2 seeks to consider redirecting up to $100 billion in unused IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, for states, allowing member governments to exchange the SDRs to borrow from one central bank reserve at a very low interest rate. We also think about the operationalization of $45 billion of IMF Administrative Resilience and Sustainability Trust, leveraging also an additional $650 billion in the IMF to set up a climate mitigation trust. Then we think about the loss and damage fund. We think about this was a fund that was initiated in COP27 under the loss and damage fund. And we know at this stage it is not something concrete, but there's provisions that are made to assist countries in the face of a disaster. And that is very critical because we are in the region. I assume, every country that is represented here in the room and those that are viewing online, listening online, has been affected, may not have been affected directly by a hurricane or a storm, but we see as a region we are affected globally, and also as a region we have been affected. So we have to take into consideration that we have to retool the way we think, retool the way we approach climate financing, and as Nikita mentioned, we have to take into consideration that us as young people, we have to be a part, we have to show up, and we have to speak up. So that is the point that we have to take into consideration going forward. So finally, to wrap up, we have the inclusive call to action, and that's where you come in as young people. And I have fragmented the team for this year's RCOY into 4 sections: building, 4 keywords: building, financial resilience, youth-led, and climate adaptation. And I want to give you some pointers of consideration that where you can play a critical part as young people in climate financing. Because when you think about climate finance, you might think it's just for those, the economists or the accountants or those persons that are working in the Ministry of Finance. Young people have a critical part to play in climate financing. So first and foremost, building. This includes the building of capacity and spurring of a renewed vision and passion and interest on not just climate financing, not only climate change, but advancing the sustainable development goals. Climate financing that is taken into consideration is not just for adaptation, but adaptation and mitigation. So you can develop projects holistically across all the 17 sustainable development goals. As simple as saving $1 a day can help to contribute to an NGO, and you can give that money to a local environmental network. A lot of persons may be a part of the Caribbean Youth Environmental Network. Just $1 it takes to provide services to support an initiative in your local communities. Also embarking on fundraising initiatives and programs to implement climate adaptation and environmental projects, aquaponics, sustainable farming, mangrove restoration, ridge to reef restoration, even as simple as beach cleanups can help to develop that programming of building capacity to enhance the access to climate financing. Then we have financial resilience. As young people, you can make your tangible contribution to your involvement in national dialogues and stakeholder consultations. So when there's stakeholder consultations by Adaptation Fund, or there's a government, your local government's call for a symposium or even an event like this, show up. Come with ideas, come with solutions, come with ideas and things that you could actually implement in your local community and at the grassroots level. It is critical that you have a voice and you amplify that voice that is within you. Financial resilience can also be accounted for through your monetary and voluntary support to climate awareness campaign. That is building the educational awareness within your community. Don't just take the information about the Green Climate Fund, but empower someone else along the line. Youth-led. This year, and I think we could give a great applause for this year, the COP28 presidency has saw it fitting to place an emphasis on young people with added attention to be placed on children. So this has resulted in the first time in the history of the Conference of Parties, which is the COP, that there is a dedicated day committed to youths, coupled by the provision of a unique pavilion catered for youth and children. And indeed, this is a milestone. So in addition, we have also seen the inaugural execution of an international youth climate delegate program, where a lot of persons, some of us who are here and viewing online, has been a part of that program, which have provided the opportunity for you to be engaged in the negotiation process, to learn about climate financing, to learn all about the different rules and the different things that take into consideration at a COP. So that is a very critical part of the youth-led component. This year's RCOY has also sought to emphasize on adaptation as a priority, as we saw in the theme: adaptation, youth-led adaptation, and building resilience. So we as individuals, as young people, we can engage in our local activities when it's in our countries, beginning at the grassroots level. And finally, as the word says, climate adaptation. As young people, we must realign our commitments and capitalize on the avenues to not only foster resilience to increase access to climate financing, but also to channel a personal roadmap for job creation and further promote sustainability across key sectors such as tourism, agriculture, infrastructure, the blue economy, industry, and biodiversity. I really want to give an appeal to every one of us as we go back to the team for this year's RCOY. As we know, we have 2 more days to go. Let us really sit in our spare time and let these words resonate within our hearts. Building, say building with me. Building, financial resilience, for youth-led, climate adaptation in the Caribbean. So you could say it however you want, in French, in English, in Spanish, whatever language you speak. It is all about building climate resilience for youth-led climate adaptation in the Caribbean. Thank you for listening, and I appeal to you that this RCOY will not just be the first or the second RCOY, but it would be the beginning of something new as we tackle the climate financing sector, and we look forward to the global stocktake and the road towards the 2030 agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bradley. That was excellent perspective, I think, to follow Ryan's conversation. And you really helped to anchor us into, so where do we go from here? You know, and I think listening to our two speakers today, my first takeaway is that we know that there's money out there, right? Money exists. We know that. But it's the question then, how do we get organized enough so that our ask is so spot on, our numbers, kutroch is how you say numbers in Amharic, so that our numbers are so clear and precise that we can receive. And then, and I think a big thing, so I keep on talking about this financial infrastructure because at COP26, I was I was working in the water pavilion, specifically on just understanding water realities in the Caribbean. And I was bemoaning the fact that I was struggling to access money on the panel. And there was a gentleman who was on the panel with me, and he looked at me in his sort of comment or reflection on what I had to say. And he said, "You're never going to get the money because you don't know how to manage it." And it was like a 1-2, okay, I see you. You know, and it's true. If you don't know how to manage the money, even when you have the money, you may mismanage it. But I think more importantly, what I've learned from executing this conference is you can even have the money, but if you can't easily move the money or spend the money, you know, you still have to have those financial systems that enable you to move money and spend the money and account for it and report for it. And I think this is something that we have to really think about. Like, as so, I think Bradley, you did an excellent job at grounding us now back to the SDGs and saying, okay, so if we use the SDGs as our structure, right? And we had talked about this in kind of the build up to the RCOY, thinking about what projects are needed in your respective communities. If we can then design the projects, or you design the projects for your respective countries as they relate to the SDGs, that is what you think the priority is, or your respective communities think the priorities are, then we need to put those projects together, right? Because we need to be putting together multi-country projects that are large enough, but that also have the financial mechanism so that we can easily receive, spend out, and circulate, right? Because we all need money coming into our communities, into our bank accounts, into our community members' bank accounts, so that we can live, thrive, adapt, but then also, you know, move forward. Because, I mean, so what? I mean, how much longer are we going to talk about the climate crisis? Like, what's the pivot? You know, there has to be a pivot. Our team understands pivot well. They came to me at a point and there was like, Nikita, we have to pivot, right? And so the pivot was we found Circle, right? And we cultivated the Circle community. We had a smaller group here in person. So my question now back to this community today is, what is our pivot? What is the plan for us to move forward so that we know exactly how much money we need to implement the projects that we need in phase 1, so that we have to take a step forward. So what is the so what coming out of this conference? So I'd love to open the floor and hear reflections, comments, questions, proposed solutions. Same thing, Ryan, if you're still with us. Maybe if you have reflections on Bradley's presentation, we'd love to hear from you as well. Ryan, is Ryan still with us? Yeah? Okay.
I am. I was just trying to figure out how to unmute. Yes. Nikita, great. And thank you for, you know, your reflections on Bradley's presentation. Bradley, great presentation. You know, laying it out and talking about connecting to the SDGs. And there's something else I want to add to that conversation with respect to how we design our projects. I think it's also important to start with the end in mind. Not just think about the project and the need that we have, but think about the mechanisms that you want to approach, because each one has its own goals, its own themes, and there are certain things that when you write a project proposal, you have to align it. So for example, with the Green Climate Fund, if you wanted to get Green Climate Fund money, you would need to align your design and your activity towards their 6 development outcomes, right? So if you were going to approach that a different fund, they would also have a different sort of flavor or agenda that you have to consider. So start with the end in mind. That's my little feedback there. Think about the projects, yes, that would benefit your communities. Think about the SDGs and how they align, but also think about who you're going to approach and what's in it for them, what they are interested in, and how do you shape your project to respond to those needs as well. And I'm also open to any questions that they may be on the floor or from Bradley as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to offer to this conversation because I founded YME when I was an undergrad, and it was my first year at University of Miami. It was 2007. And since then, the organization has gone through various cycles of governance, as I've been learning, as sort of governance structures has shifted. And maybe within the past, say, 3 years, I've realized that social enterprise, from my perspective, is really where it's at. Because when you are dependent on grant cycles, and don't get me wrong, the Green Climate Fund, and I think it's important that we put proposals together forward to the Green Climate Fund and other funding bodies, because there's funding available that can support our work. And sometimes those systems are not reliable, and they're not always sustainable, because when those funding sources dry up, then you have no flow, no cash flow. And so what I've been reflecting on for the past sort of 2-3 years really is, how do we design these businesses that are these social enterprises, right? These systems that have these positive cash flows that can support our adaptation. Right, so one of the projects that I've been exploring is called Ocean Love Coffee, and it came from attending an AU trade meeting in Tanzania and just sort of connecting with people. And so we're exploring the sales of coffee as a way to, if we can scale it up large enough, to create real cash flows that can support the education that's required in our communities, the training of community scientists, the healing educational spaces for different communities. So I think as we're thinking about the projects that we can design as they relate to our specific communities, I really think it's important for us to reflect on what are the business models, what are the services and or products or flows that we can participate in that are more sustainable and regenerative for us financially than just a please sir, may I please have, and then also being subject to what the donor feels is or isn't relevant. Because that's why there's a lot of people not in this room, because a lot of the donors that we approach were like, we only want to fund this country. What am I supposed to say? Right? So when donors have special interests, or funding bodies that are funded by countries that have special interests that don't align with our realities and what we need, we're grateful to receive financial resources where we can. And also we're talking about our survival, y'all. So we need to have a plan. And part of that plan is, how are we going to make that money so that we can be independent? Because when the hurricane comes, if you don't have a shutter, people in my community go to the cave, man. We learned today that people go to the gutters or the storm drains. That's not okay. It's not okay. And in the absence of the white horse running in to save us, we need a plan to save ourselves. And we're not just talking about saving ourselves. We also need to sustain, but we need to be thriving, because it's human rights, And that includes education in safe spaces or brave spaces, that includes fresh water, food that's not in a can, You know, so there's a lot of aspects to what resilience will look like and gets to look like for us, but we have to be the ones to drive it. I was speaking to someone earlier today and I said, we have some of the most brilliant Caribbean minds in the room here. And if our countries, our collective countries have a fighting chance, it's going to be born out of the co-creation that's existing and happening throughout this week. So I encourage you to dive deep into, and by room, I also mean Zoom land. You know, you're also in the room. We're all in the room together. So I encourage us all to really dive deep into what is our next plan. All right, we know the systems that exist. How can we use the existing systems to support us? And what do we need to do? What do we need to build so that we ensure that there are systems that truly support us and are ensuring that there's a foundation for the next 7 generations? So with that, I'd love to hear comments, reflections from the floor. I don't know if there's anyone in Zoom chat that has comments. I think there's a conversation link. Yeah, please take the mic.
Okay, so it's just like common question for everybody. It's like we are talking all the time about the CARICOM community, but for example, Dominican Republic and Cuba are not part of the CARICOM community. So it's like just to ask to the other ones that you are from here, like you are from countries that are from the CARICOM community, what do you think about this? And if do you believe that countries and islands that are also Caribbean islands like the Dominican Republic and Cuba should be part of the CARICOM too?
Go ahead, Shanda.
It was just like, okay, on Brad's presentation, he said for like $1 a day, you could do the environmental thing. And it's just like, that's an icky feeling because I think we all know the UNICEF kind of commercials that used to always be rolling out. For $1 a day, you could save this child. And I'm like, it's kind of colonial, it's kind of icky. So just, yeah, it's that simple, but still we have to watch how we talk about it because we don't want to be in the same situation where, please, sir, give us some money. So yeah, thanks, yeah.
Could I ask you to sort of just repeat what you said about CARICOM or your question again?
Yeah, it's like all the time here, it's talking about the CARICOM community. And of course, because most of the representations are from countries and islands that are from the CARICOM community. And the CARICOM is like a really important association, society, and cooperation. But 2 of the biggest islands of the Caribbean, like the Dominican Republic and Cuba, are not part from the CARICOM community. So it's just like more to know what you, people from countries that are from the CARICOM community, what do you think about this? And if you think that they should include the Dominican Republic and Cuba in the CARICOM community, or maybe should be form another community to include these countries?
I just think like just due to classification, like Dominican Republic and Cuba generally fall into Latin America because it's Spanish speaking. So, and CARICOM came from it means Caribbean Commonwealth because it was like the designation of islands that were formerly from the British rule. So that's why it follows that history. So in terms of, for this conference, we have 33 islands, so that, or 33 countries in the Caribbean. So I would be a proponent of like forming something that's a Caribbean name rather than the CARICOM or the Latin America, because even when you say Latin America and the Caribbean, you know, sometimes the Caribbean is kind of silent. So even those kind of things, it's because language, history, all those kind of things. So I think it's best to make something new. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and also it's because with the Latin America thing, it's a little bit complicated because many people don't include the Dominican Republic and Cuba in Latin America.
Yeah.
Yeah, I promise you. So if we are not in CARICOM, if we are not in Latin America, we are nowhere. So yeah, I really like the idea of like a more together and conjoined Caribbean, that there's for sure that Cuba and the Dominican Republic are in the Caribbean. But yeah, I promise you many times if you say Latin America, people are not going to include Cuba and the Dominican Republic because they consider the Caribbean. And the Caribbean for many people is not Latin America. So yeah.
I love that we're having this conversation, and I really appreciate that you brought that up. And this is why we were very intentional about reaching out to the 33 countries within the region, because we know the Caribbean is such this interesting community. It's a melting pot, but also we still have the colonial countries that are still very present within the region, you know, that are just sort of now their various protectorates or territories. We have the countries that have gained their independence from the respective countries, but yet because they were, as you said, descendants of the respective colonial power, their governance systems are a bit different, their languages are a bit different, so then there's not necessarily that overlap. And as that was so clearly and articulately said, the Latin America is Latin America. Y'all may speak Spanish, but that's about it. You know, and then even when the Caribbean, when we have like, and I love that so many of you in this room are going to be at Latin American Climate Action Week next week, because I think that's going to be, you're going to have such a strong presence of being able to tell our story coming out of this week. And this is why we're doing this, so that we can have a stronger collective voice. But the idea of creating a community or a narrative or infrastructure where we are one peoples, all 33 of us, 33 respective countries, I think is a very powerful and inspiring thought, especially when grounded in financial infrastructure that makes sense. I'm terrified because is that the hurricane that you're looking at, the hurricane track? It's real. I don't know if you've been following it. There's a hurricane. I looked at it last week. There's a path that's building in the middle of the Atlantic right now. And so last time I looked, it was about 60% potential of forming. It just became a tropical storm. So this is our reality, fam, right? Like it doesn't get any more realer than this. So the decisions, the conversations that we are having this week matter because lives literally depend on it, right? So my question then, if there is an infrastructure, a community of 33, of representatives from 33 countries that has financial infrastructure that supports climate action and sustainable development, you know, where then do we go from here? Or what are those next steps or possibilities or desires? Knowing that there's a tropical storm brewing right now in the Atlantic with how hot we know our waters are. And we know that like these hurricanes, tropical storms are just one of many hazards that we have to deal with. Ryan, before, I know you are very sensitive for time and we are kind of at the hour. If you're still with us, are there any final reflections you would like to leave us with?
Ryan isn't here anymore.
Okay.
I did want to say somebody, just Acosta mentioned the chat, not to forget about Carousel, Aruba, and Bonaire when talking about, I think the not being in the CARICOM community as well.
Thank you. And you know, this is what one of our challenges. We tried really hard in our ability to reach all of the countries, and we know we were limited by language, and not just language, but kind of just network. You know, and I think that was kind of the barrier, was that our networks weren't deep enough to reach deep enough into sort of the Dutch Caribbean. So actions coming out of this conversation I'm hearing is create the projects for the financial plans that we need. So create the projects and build the budgets. And then also who, that I think, Walteria, I love, this question is now stuck in my head because of who's not in this room and that needs to be in this room. And whoever's not in this room, we have to make sure we find someone who can help that, ensure that that representation is present. Please, Abigail.
Regarding CARICOM, Elena, Dominican Republic, I believe, I stand to be corrected by anyone with knowledge. Historically, they have not expressed any interest in joining CARICOM. So in as much as we feel like some islands have been excluded, there hasn't been interest from such islands. I'm not sure why. Remember, if you do Caribbean studies, you would see there are different definitions for what makes an island a Caribbean island. Some of them are because of geographic location. Some of them is because they're washed by the Caribbean Sea, culture, etc., etc. So in that vein, they've never made attempts or has shown strong enough interest to come and be a part of CARICOM. So that's my first point. My second comment, which the latter part is a question to you, Mr. Douglas. And I'll start by answering the latter part of what Nikita would have said when she said who's not here. And I haven't heard anyone ever said the private sector. They're not here. And a lot of times when countries, we think about funding, we think about the international organizations. How many years now have we been struggling to get their attention, to get the monies they say that's accessible, etc.? But what we do have in many of our Caribbean countries is a very strong private sector. Most Caribbean islands, and I believe St. Kitts was the start of it, has a program called CBI, which is Citizenship by Investment, right? We have a lot of these people coming and building big hotels, multi-million-dollar enterprises in our countries. Part of their due diligence as a CBI agent is to see how you can give back to the local communities, etc. Now, of course, the dialogue would have to be from a government point of view as to how they channel that money. Because, of course, these CBI agents and whoever work on their behalf, we know that at the end of the day, they look to see how they get a return from whatever money they put out into there, right? So my question to you, Mr. Douglas, is how big of a role has the private sector played in climate finance, and has our governments and regional bodies and local bodies, have they been tapping into the private sector for funding with the same aggression and passion as they're doing to the international bodies?
Well, agencies like the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, they have, as part of the programming, apart from the readiness and the simplified approval process, they have a specific, I would say, not necessarily a department that deals with the private sector, trying to create a public-private sector partnership, right? And I've known from experience, from a regional standpoint, and in some cases nationally, that the private sector wants to engage, but at times they don't participate proactively in the stakeholder consultations at the initial stage of the ideation phase of developing the concept note. Because, for example, with the Green Climate Fund, you don't just approach the Green Climate Fund. It takes almost 3 years to almost 2 to 3 years to get a full funding proposal, depending on if you have all the things in place, your fiduciary standards, all the different social and environmental safeguards. So even as much as that, if the private sector don't see an opportunity where it's a spin-off, because they invest in money, right? And sometimes it's not a situation that they invest in all of the money. They have to provide a partial, they have a co-financing. So you could have, like, the government has 70%, GCF finances XYZ amount, and a regional organization is as a whole conglomerate of different agencies. So at times you realize that the private sector is a little bit reluctant in participating because of the time span. That could be one of the factors, the time span that the GCF takes to give a response in finalizing a funding proposal. Also, many times that the way that GCF operates is that they channel most of the information through the ND, which is a national designated authority, which is the public sector. So within a country, there's a disparity between not a big amount of, there's not a presence of private sector engagement from, like, cooperative credit unions or even banking institutions. A lot of them may be reluctant to invest in such a thing because, I mean, especially if it's a situation that there's not a clear indication of, okay, sustainability, what am I going to benefit from this type of project? There may be some reluctancy in terms of their participation. So you might realize that they want to be involved in climate action, but most of the times it's the government or the public sector that really drives the ministries, the Ministry of Education, Environment, and even within that ambit, there's sometimes a lot of bottlenecks there because you may not have the full participation. You might have a stakeholder consultation, but let's say you invite 50 people and only, let's say, 12 persons show up. So you don't have a participation of the young people, gender, a representation of the private sector, which is very critical because if you have all these things, GCF places a very important emphasis on having as much representation of stakeholders. And many of times you have consultations and there's not a private sector showing up. And many of times you wonder why isn't they participating in such initiatives? And I'm thinking it depends on the turnover and also what can I gain from this type of project. So there's some silos there and there needs to be a bit more synergy. That's one of the reasons why 5Cs have these operational mechanisms to try to create that partnership between the public and the private sector to have big projects that are not at the small scale level, but projects that are interregional and also could have scalability, not just for 3 years, but what do you do after 3 years of implementation? You could have a phase 2, then a phase 3. So that is the direction that we would have to go in terms of the region to proactively have projects.
And that's good. And I hear you. And I applaud the organization for wanting to create that sort of partnership between private and government. However, I think there's a colloquial or Caribbean saying that we need to learn how to dance home before we dance abroad. And many times I feel like we try to dance abroad and then come back and dance home, because if our approach is not effective in getting the private sector, which plays a very important role when it comes to financing, etc., within our economy, if we're not getting their attention and changing our approach as to how we do that, how do we think we're going to get the international support? How do we think international backing is just going to come by that? And so one of the things I believe our local government and regional governments should really do is see how we can change our methodologies, see how we can change our approach, see how we can be innovative in capturing the attention of the private sector and getting them to understand the importance with aggression, with passion, like we approach the big people out there. I believe my friend, well, she's not in here, I believe she would have mentioned it this morning in the way in which we probably would greet the Queen and how we would greet our friends. Let's see how we can get them in our local bodies in our countries to side with us, and probably they too can come and be our backing when we go to the international stage. Remember, they've been sitting in these things for years. They probably could be advisors and support when we go to these negotiations to show us the ins and outs, the read between the lines, etc., etc. And I do believe that's one of the reasons why Caribbean islands always go to COP and it's never with one voice. It's everybody always going to say Grenada needs 200 million, Guyana needs XYZ, Trinidad needs what and what and what. We know it's already hard to get the funding, but we still go with so many different aims and goals for our countries individually instead of going as a collective with one voice, with one mission, saying the Caribbean is asking for this, and when we get this, we amongst ourselves are going to determine where the allocation goes according to needs, etc., etc. But we don't have that happening.
Well, to kind of expound on that with the whole area of the Caribbean, that would be for like a regional project, but one of the areas for GCF is country ownership. They're very big on country ownership. So most of the projects have to be aligned to the NDCs, which is the National Determined Contributions. Each country normally every 5 years would have that set target goals of what they're going to do in terms of the climate change policy. So it's not sometimes a situation that's easier said than done. And I think one of the issues is that they've been, many governments and many countries have been trying to adopt what is a private sector financing strategy to see how they could actually use that policy-related document to engage more with the public sector. So country ownership is very important. So sometimes it's very difficult to have approach the GCF if you don't have that national priorities. You have to align, everything must be aligned with the national goals and priorities.
So I have a follow-up question to that, because what happens if what we need is funding to support capacity building and education, but that's not listed in the NDC in our respective country?
Well, capacity building and education, that's one of the reasons why the GCF would offer readiness activities where there's capacity building. It depends on how you draft and you coin that readiness activity. So let's say, perchance, in every year, they offer $300,000, $1 million to each Caribbean country to build capacity building. So institutional strengthening, that could be for climate awareness campaigns, advocacy in schools. So it depends on how you use that money to actually build your capacity first before you advance in submitting a proposal to the GCF.
So then this is where I'm really challenged, because what's $1 million, y'all? What's $1 million? I mean, if we don't understand money, $1 million is a lot of money. But but I mean, there are homes in the Bahamas that are $32 million, right? Okay, so, but the reality is most of us don't really understand numbers at scale. So we hear $1 million and we're like, yo, that's money for life, I've made it. But it's not. And $1 million can barely push the needle as it relates to what we really need in our communities. And so my question is like, so these mechanisms that are like, okay, here's $1 million for you, cool. But you know what $1 million is? That's $33,000 per country of the 33 countries. It's like, it's not.
No, each country has the access to that 1 million.
Right, but what I'm saying is like, when we understand scale and we understand what we really need, $1 million is nothing. So it's great, thank you for the $1 million, we're gonna use it, but we need to understand how much we really need to do what we need to do. And this is where the gap is, because our numbers game isn't strong enough yet. And so we really need to lean hard into understanding what the real costs are, which includes budgeting for the toilet paper, right? Like, our budgets need to get so on point that we're not, because what I have done the hard way is I've just budgeted for the big ticket things. And then all of a sudden you realize like most of the budget is like everything else in my time, which is not factored in, right? So we have to learn that we have to budget for our time, we have to budget for all the miscellaneous, the gas, the travel, the electricity, the internet, the phone, and
all the logistics behind it.
So when you do that, all of a sudden $1 million is nothing when you're doing it at scale, right? And you're doing it on islands where we already know cost of living is exorbitant. It's almost $10 for gas in my island, US dollars, right, for a gallon. It did it. It doesn't make sense, but this is our reality, and therefore we have to plan for our reality. So while I think these mechanisms that our governments are working on are important for us to understand and to access those finances where they are available, I think we have to get really intentional on how we can use our talent and our skills to create the financial flows that will support the work that we need to do. So that's what I would really like us to reflect on coming out of this week. Let's figure it out. We got to start somewhere, but we have to begin collectively with those who are present, and then we keep adding on until we hit that 33 so that we have real budgets that we can implement, and we all know what needs to be done. So the implementation part is the easy part for us. We just need the money in our hands and in ways that we can spend it with ease.
I think that's where the social enterprise area would come in, as you mentioned, only that at the grassroots level, like you start doing things, incubator programs and small community group activities, and then you build out from there. So that could be a very a good approach.
Oh, I'm happy that Ms. Nikita brought this up, because one of the questions I have for you, sir, is has there been any tracking to weigh the effectiveness of the monies that's been given to these countries? Because we spoke today about, she's not here, we spoke today about equality and equity. And I just wanted to tie this back into the financing. Now, Ms. Nikita made a very good point. It doesn't seem like we understand numbers and the scale of things. Because if we really do, each country would not be receiving $1 million, because trust me, there are countries who probably don't need it. There are countries who probably need half of what we're saying, and there are countries, that probably needs 3 times the amount that they're receiving. So how how has your organization been capturing that data? Have they been studying and analyzing that data to study future trends to see how we can better allocate the monies to these countries? Not because we want to say we give them money, but because we're giving them money so that they can be effective in their implementation.
Just to put a
I'm
little
sorry,
snippet.
Abigail. I'm sorry, Bradley. We're gonna have to wrap up right there. The bus is apparently gonna leave at 5:30, so we're gonna have to wrap this up. Thank you all so much for your questions and participation.
Thank you,
But we'll have
Majan.
to, yes.
So I'm going to pass over to Alyssa.
Hi. Right. So I hope everybody had a good day today. Apologies for my kind of hair and my job. But we're good. So tomorrow is actually going to be a very eventful day because I am excited. I haven't been excited much lately, but tomorrow we're going to have a good day. Coastal Zone Management Unit will be taking us on a tour tomorrow from 9 o'clock. We'll be getting to see projects which the unit has been managing in terms of like coastal resilience. We will get to see projects that fall under the Coastal Infrastructure Program, which falls into something that was mentioned before in terms of private sector, because the funding was done by combination of the government of Barbados as well as IDB. So I'm very excited about that. So here's a few announcements. We leave here at 9. Please be cautious of what you wear because we're going to be in the sun and we're going to on a board. So comfortable shoes, enclosed shoes. I don't advise you to wear them. Very hot outside. And then after that, we're going to get a guest speaker from SEDEMA who will be discussing disaster risk reduction, as well as some work that SEDEMA has been doing. And then a disaster risk specialist will be coming for our adaptation and disaster risk reduction session. So you get an opportunity to speak with an actual specialist who does this in the field for. And then we go straight into the water mitigation, agriculture, and sustainable energy DD session. So it's going to be a very tough working day. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we get back here by 11:30 because those DD sessions start at 1, as well as the presentation. So it gives everybody at least an hour and a half to get lunch. But that is all for announcements. Any questions in terms of the proceedings tomorrow? Yes. Closed toes or sneakers? If you have slippers, that's fine because you might want to go on the beach because we're actually going near the beach. Any other questions? You are free if you want to, but just make sure to bring a towel. I'm not sure if you get back on the bus though. Any other questions? No? All right, guys, so we're gonna have the bus coming here at 5:30, so you could just pack up and get ready. But just for a team, with me outside. We need some pictures with some people in front of this banner and a few boxes, and our photographer is staying back a little bit to get those pictures. So if you are feeling the photo.
Yes, please. Beautiful pictures are always good. You'll look good. Hi. How we doing? I'm good.